Hello, my name is Stephen Williams and I'm a Housing and Welfare Advisor at Ssafa. Today I'm going to talk to you about housing and benefits. With the recent changes in housing law and allocation of local authority properties, Ssafa volunteers face increasing inquiries about housing. But just how will this affect our clients? Today we will cover a bit of background on the housing situation, a little bit about the Localism Act 2011 and how this has affected local authority housing, like the changes in benefits like the under-occupational rules, also known as the bedroom tax, and legislation that is affecting the armed forces community. Before we can understand the current housing situation, we need to understand the past. Census figures show that 1 in 5 families now rent, which has doubled since 2001. The proportion of families who now own their own home has dropped by 13%. Since 2003, local authorities have operated choice-based lettings. These schemes varied from area to area but were broadly the same. Applicants would bid for accommodation of their choice. Applicants with the highest priority for the longest period of time would be shortlisted for the property. This system was designed to offer choice and replace the old housing registers, where applicants were placed on a rating list. Local authorities had to give reasonable preference to certain categories of people: the homeless or those owed a homelessness duty, those who are occupying in sanitary accommodation or overcrowded accommodation, those who need to move on medical or welfare grounds, those who need to move to a particular area in the borough where failure to move would cause hardship. Now we will move on to the current situation. Many of our caseworkers will be aware of the changes under the Localism Act 2011, which may have affected your clients. The Localism Act now puts the local authorities in a position where they can exclude a whole class of applicants. They have the power to prescribe classes of people who will qualify for social housing. For example, key workers employed in the borough. The only class of people that local authorities cannot discriminate is the class of people based on their immigration status. Qualification for social housing now depends on which local authority that you are applying to. So how different are these changes? Anyone can apply for accommodation. As you can see, waiting times are pretty lengthy. For example, Westminster Council reports you can wait up to 12.5 years for a 4-bedroom property. The changes now, which means you have to be a qualifying person, means that this has substantially reduced the waiting times for local authority accommodation. It's reduced the local authority's waiting lists, but unless you are a qualifying person, to get onto that list, you will never get social housing. Here we can see that in Westminster alone, 1,700 homeless people are on the council property waiting list. Many of the people who fall into other priority groups are often considered vulnerable. Many Ssafa caseworkers will be dealing with clients in this vulnerable group. Now we will talk about housing benefits. Housing benefit is a payment that is made to applicants who are living in social housing to cover their rent. Anybody can apply for housing benefit who are living in social housing and are on low income or on income-based benefits. It is estimated that 5 million people are on housing benefit. In December 2011, 1 in 4 households in receipt of housing benefit were employed. We also need to consider local housing allowance. Local housing allowance was a new name for housing benefit, which is the same workings as housing benefit, but was introduced in April 2011, which is for applicants who live in private rented accommodation to cover their rent. The amount that you will be able to claim for local housing allowance will depend on your income, your savings, and how many adult children living in that accommodation. You can find details of the national cap in the research paper that will be accompanying this presentation on the extranet. Now we're going to have a quick look at discretionary housing payment. Discretionary housing payment is, as it says on the title, it's a discretionary payment made by the local authorities for applicants who are qualifying for housing benefit and council tax benefit. This benefit is paid to help with those who are having difficulties paying either their rent or their council tax. The decision for getting this payment is dependent on the local authority. It is at their discretion to who gets that payment. Once that money is ended or the pot is finished, that is the end until the next financial year. So now I'm going to look at an example to illustrate all the benefits that I've outlined above. Mr. and Mrs. Smith live in a 2-bedroom property. Mr. Smith is disabled, needs constant care and supervision. This is severe enough that Mrs. Smith has to sleep in the spare room. As an adult couple, housing benefit entitlement covers rent for a one-bedroom property. But as we know, Mr. and Mrs. Smith need a two-bedroom property. They put in a transfer request with their local housing association, but with no small properties available, as a secured tenant moving out to a private sector one-bedroom property, the Smiths will lose their security of tenure and the property is likely to be more expensive. Discretionary housing payment is appropriate for their needs, but is only a short-term fix for a long-term problem. Discretionary housing payment is made only for 3 to 6 months. Now I'd like to talk to you about the widely debated bedroom tax. A study in 2013 by the National Housing Federation found that 14,000 households fell into arrears with their rent. 6,000 of these, this was for the first time. 26,500 households fell into in Merseyside felt the impact. The shortage of smaller homes, only 155 families managed to downsize into a housing association property. The sector who will feel the brunt of the bedroom tax are disabled people. Just imagine the type of accommodation that they are living in. Often disabled accommodation has been adapted for their needs, which is a time and costly process. Now we're going to move on to the Military Covenant and how this has affected housing and benefits. The Military Covenant is a pledge by the government to offer assistance to the military community so they are not at a disadvantage from their civilian counterparts. Often serving and service leavers will find themselves priced out of the housing market because of the very nature of the type of work that they're doing, often travelling across the world and across the country and not establishing a local connection in that particular area that they are in or intending to move to. Some councils have now introduced some initiatives to help service leavers. For example, Birmingham City Council have now got a dedicated housing advice officer that will help service leavers with their housing options. This housing officer will contact service leavers 3 months before they are discharged from the services to be able to offer them advice, assistance and guidance and provide them with options for their housing needs. Historically, veterans have not been classified as vulnerable. For example, a single service leaver who is under the age of 35 would not be considered a priority need with local authority. Often the problem with service leavers are that they do not know their housing options and where to get access to housing information. Now we will touch on the new regulations supporting the armed forces community. First, we will look at the allocation of housing qualification criteria for Armed Forces England Regulation 2012. The purpose of this regulation is to ensure, because of the difficulties of proving a local connection as a service leaver, that they are not put at a disadvantage. This regulation underlines and reinforces their right to apply for social housing in that local area so they're not at a disadvantage, which covers the spirit of the Military Covenant. Let's look at our example of Mr. and Mrs. Smith again. On his discharge, Mr. Smith wanted to settle in Leeds, where Mrs. Smith grew up. Despite the fact that they haven't lived in Leeds for the past 20 years because Mr. Smith was in the army, so they moved around a lot, they would now not be at a disadvantage. The Housing Act 1996 Additional Preference for Former Armed Forces Personnel, England 2012, goes a step further by saying additional preference must be given to certain serving and ex-serving members of the armed forces and reserve forces. The allocation scheme should give additional preference to people who fall within the reasonable preference categories and have an urgent housing needs. As you can see from Mr. and Mrs. Smith case, they will have less time to wait to move back to Leeds. Details of both these regulations can be found in the research paper accompanying this presentation, which is available on the extranet. Another area which is worth remembering is the MOD referral scheme, also known as the MOD nomination scheme. The nomination scheme historically was introduced in the early 1990s, offering nomination rights for ex-MOD properties to be available through local association accommodation. The scheme is open to service leavers within the last 6 months of their service. They can apply for the scheme by contacting the Joint Service Housing Advice Office. Now these nomination rights have ceased, it is now local authorities who are contacted by JSHL and offering accommodation which may be suitable to a client. This client may be a family or a single service leaver. The scheme does not demand a local connection. Application is dependent on suitability of that person and availability of accommodation which will match the two. So a single service leaver could be matched up with a one-bedroom property. There are several government initiatives that are worth mentioning as well. There is the shared ownership and there is the new buy scheme, and if you're in social housing, the right to buy schemes. Details of these schemes are available in the research paper accompanying this presentation, available on the extranet. So in conclusion, with the benefit cuts, the shortage of social housing and a severe strain on the private rental sector, which is more expensive than the social sector, unless you are a high priority, the reality is that you will never be able to get social accommodation. I hope you found this presentation useful. My name is Stephen Williams. Thank you.